The Chaco War, fought between Bolivia and Paraguay from 1932 to 1935, was one of the most devastating conflicts in South American history. It was a brutal and protracted struggle over the Gran Chaco region, a vast and inhospitable territory believed to hold significant natural resources, particularly oil. The war was rooted in historical territorial disputes, economic interests, and national pride, but its consequences extended far beyond the battlefield. Bolivia had a hard time getting to the modern world. After breaking away from Spain in 1825, the country struggled with political instability, poor economic growth, and losing land. Bolivia lost its access to the Pacific Ocean to Chile during the War of the Pacific from 1879 to 1884, a terrible blow. This loss made Bolivia economically weak and landlocked, making it feel bad about itself and want to return to being a regional power. Before the 20th century, Bolivia became more modernized because of its natural resources. However, this economic growth wasn't happening everywhere, and the country was still divided along racial and class lines. The Chaco War broke out in this setting as Bolivia tried to assert its independence and find its place in the modern world. The Gran Chaco, a vast area with few people, became the center of a nasty land dispute between Bolivia and Paraguay. There were legal and historical reasons for both countries' claims to the Chaco, but economic reasons and national pride also played a role. The government of Bolivia said that the Chaco was part of the Spanish colonial administrative unit of Charcas, which later became Bolivia. On the other hand, Paraguay claimed the Chaco because it had been in charge of the area since the early 1800s and there were Guarani communities there. In the early 1900s, oil was found in the foothills of the Andes, which made people more interested in the Chaco. Bolivia, Paraguay, and oil companies from other countries all thought that the area might have many oil reserves. Because of its economic potential, the Chaco went from being a remote and mostly ignored area to one that was fiercely contested. Bolivia saw the Chaco as a chance to return to the Atlantic Ocean, which it had lost to Chile in the War of the Pacific. The Chaco was a sign of Paraguay's national sovereignty and a barrier against Bolivia's growth. Foreign powers, such as Argentina and the US, with economic interests in the region, got involved in the dispute. Argentina, for instance, was interested in the Chaco due to its potential as a buffer zone against Bolivia's expansion. The US, on the other hand, was eyeing the region for its strategic importance in the global oil market. The 1920s and the road to the Chaco. As Bolivia and Paraguay set up military bases in the Chaco in the 1920s, tensions between the two countries grew. Fighting broke out between Bolivian and Paraguayan forces, and diplomatic efforts to end the conflict failed. By 1932, the situation had escalated to a critical point, leading to the outbreak of a full-scale war. In the 1920s, both Bolivia and Paraguay started building up their armies in the Chaco. With a larger population and more money, Bolivia invested heavily in modern weapons and infrastructure. Even though Paraguay was smaller and poorer, it focused on adapting its military strategy to the rough terrain of the Chaco. Bolivia and Paraguay could not settle their disagreements peacefully, even though many people tried to help, including the League of Nations. Peace talks didn't work, which led to war. The Chaco War and the building of a stronger state. The Chaco War significantly changed the governments and societies of both Bolivia and Paraguay. In Bolivia, the war revealed deep divisions in the military and political elite, which caused social unrest and political instability. It also led to nationalist and reformist movements, which formed the Bolivian National Revolution in 1952. Bolivia employed modern weapons and a hierarchical command structure during the Chaco War. However, the Chaco's harsh conditions, including extreme heat, lack of water, and rough terrain, quickly wore down Bolivian forces. It was hard for the army to keep up with supplies and morale, and the people in charge were often criticized for not understanding what was happening in the field. Despite being smaller and less equipped, Paraguay demonstrated remarkable resilience in the harsh conditions of the Chaco. The Paraguayan army's effective use of guerrilla tactics and reliance on the knowledge of native guides who knew the area well gave them a significant advantage in the war, showcasing their strategic prowess and determination. The Chaco War had a profound impact on the home fronts in Bolivia and Paraguay. The mobilization of resources and people for the war caused significant changes in society and the economy, highlighting the far-reaching effects of the conflict. The war in Bolivia showed how unequal things were on a social and economic level. Native American soldiers were often treated like second-class citizens by the government, which made people angry and helped nationalist and reformist movements grow. The war also hurt Bolivia's economy, which caused prices to rise and supplies of essential goods to run out. In Paraguay, the war strengthened the military and the party in power, the Colorado Party. Paraguay won the war in the end because the government was able to get resources together and keep people supporting the cause. However, the war was very bad for Paraguay's economy and society, and thousands of soldiers and civilians were killed or forced to leave their homes. The internationalization of a nationalist revolution. The Chaco War drew significant international attention, with many countries and groups participating in the conflict. The League of Nations, a precursor to the United Nations, made several attempts to mediate the conflict. It proposed a ceasefire and a plebiscite to determine the ownership of the Chaco, but these efforts were largely unsuccessful due to the reluctance of the warring parties to accept international intervention. The war underscored the limitations of international organizations in resolving conflicts in other countries. The Chaco War was further complicated by the involvement of foreign powers. Bolivia, for instance, received military assistance from Germany and other European nations, while Argentina supported Paraguay. This foreign intervention prolonged the conflict and added layers of complexity to the war. The triumph. Paraguay's military strategy emphasized mobility and flexibility. Unlike Bolivia, which relied on heavy equipment and large, cumbersome units, Paraguay deployed smaller, more agile forces that could move quickly through the dense terrain. This mobility gave Paraguay a significant tactical advantage. The Paraguayan army was led by skilled and experienced commanders, such as Colonel José Félix Estigarribia, who demonstrated exceptional strategic and tactical acumen. Paraguay initially adopted a defensive strategy, focusing on holding key positions and repelling Bolivian advances. However, Paraguay shifted to an offensive strategy as the war progressed, launching counterattacks and encircling Bolivian forces. This combination of defense and offense allowed Paraguay to wear down Bolivia's larger army. Paraguay employed guerrilla tactics, including ambushes, hit-and-run attacks, and sabotage of Bolivian supply lines. Bolivia invested heavily in modern weaponry, including tanks, airplanes, and artillery. However, these assets were often ineffective in the Chaco's dense forests and swamps. Bolivia's reliance on heavy equipment slowed its advance and made it vulnerable to Paraguayan ambushes. Bolivia struggled to maintain supply lines across the vast and inhospitable Chaco. The lack of roads, water sources, and infrastructure made transporting troops, equipment, and supplies to the front lines difficult. As a result, Bolivian soldiers often faced shortages of food, water, and ammunition. Bolivia's military leadership was often criticized for being out of touch with battlefield realities. Commanders frequently issued unrealistic orders and failed to adapt to changing conditions. Additionally, Bolivia's soldiers, many of whom were conscripts from the highlands, were ill-suited to the Chaco's extreme heat and unfamiliar terrain. Low morale and desertion were common problems in the Bolivian army. Another key factor in Paraguay's victory was its ability to mobilize its population and resources. Paraguay demonstrated remarkable unity and resilience during the war, despite being a smaller and poorer nation. The Chaco War ended in 1935 when the League of Nations brokered a peace treaty. After successfully defending its territory and killing many Bolivian soldiers, Paraguay emerged as the winner. The end of the war was bittersweet though, because it destroyed both countries. The war was marked by a series of brutal and hard-fought battles, including the Battle of Campo Villa, the Battle of Nanawa, and the Battle of Boquerón. These battles were characterized by extreme conditions and heavy casualties, with both sides suffering significant losses. About 80,000 people died on both sides of the Chaco War, making it one of the deadliest wars in South American history. Many people died in the Chaco because of the harsh conditions, such as the high temperatures, disease, and lack of water. A lot of soldiers died of thirst, malaria, and other illnesses. Others died because the war was too brutal on their minds. The war also greatly affected the people who lived in both countries who weren't fighting. The conflict cost the economies of Bolivia and Paraguay a lot of money, and forced thousands of native people who lived in the Chaco to leave their homes, or die. The Chaco War changed both Bolivia and Paraguay in big ways. When the Treaty of Buenos Aires was signed in 1938, it gave most of the disputed land to Paraguay. Bolivia kept a small part of the Chaco. When oil was found in the area, however, it was a letdown because the reserves were not as big as expected. In Bolivia, the war revealed deep divisions in the military and political elite, which caused social unrest and an unstable government. The war also led to nationalist and reformist movements, which formed the Bolivian National Revolution of 1952. In Paraguay, the war strengthened the military and the ruling party, the Colorado Party. The victory in the Chaco War became a source of national pride and an important part of being a Paraguayan. The Chaco War showed how weak borders are and how easily things can go wrong in South America. It also showed how limited international groups like the League of Nations are in their ability to settle disputes in the region. The war still has effects on the relationship between Bolivia and Paraguay, and on the region's politics in general. The Chaco War was a terrible and life-changing war in Bolivia and Paraguay that changed their politics, society, and economy. The war was caused by a long-standing dispute over land and was fueled by economic interests and national pride. It killed tens of thousands of soldiers and civilians and left behind a legacy of anger and bitterness. Even though it killed a lot of people, the Chaco War also brought about change by sparking movements for political and social reform in both countries. The Chaco War is a reminder of how dangerous nationalism can be, how complicated border disputes can be, and how long-lasting war can be for both people and societies.